This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jacinta Thompson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Bob Hawke Ministerial Centre. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land we meet on today is Kaurna land. We wish to express our respect for the Kaurna people, their elders and ancestors, and to acknowledge the spiritual and cultural relationship they have with their traditional land. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight on behalf of the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia to our presentation with world champion debater Bo Seo as he discusses his latest book, Good Arguments, what the art of debating can teach us about listening better and disagreeing well. And I would also like to warmly welcome Bo to Adelaide and thank you for joining us as part of your very extensive national tour, and to his mum as well. Thank you for joining us from Sydney. You must be very proud. Yes. So Bo Seo is a two-time world champion debater and a former coach of the Australian national debating team and the Harvard College Debating Union. Bo has written for many publications, including the New York Times, The Atlantic and CNN. He has worked as a national reporter for the Australian Financial Review and has been a regular panellist on The Drum. Bo graduated from Harvard University and received a master's degree in public policy. He is currently a Juris Doctor candidate at Harvard Law School. Following Bo's presentation, he will be joined on stage by Emeritus Professor Rick Sarre, who will facilitate the end conversation, and a warm welcome to Rick as well. Thank you for joining us. So I'd now like to hand over to Bo Seo, who will present for 20 minutes. Thank you.
I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're gathered, and I salute too the late Bob Hawke, who understood that our differences can enlarge us, and who showed us that the truest expression of love for country is neither flattery nor self-deception, but a vital vision for its future. I'm grateful to patron Justice Michael Kirby, to Professor Rick Sarre, to Jacinta Thompson for their warm hospitality, and I want to thank all of you for being here. I've now been on the road with this book for about a month, which is a vision of purgatory that no one has imagined before. And I started in the US, and I went through the press in the UK, and home, Australia, is the last leg of the journey, and Adelaide is my last stop. And when I heard that 400 people had registered for this event, I thought people must have mistaken me for a Korean pop star. And I thought about redoing my hair before coming up. But the truth turned out to be altogether more hopeful, which is that Adelaide is a place of ideas, that in its openness to hearing new perspectives and in its generosity in being willing to engage in the conversation, rivals any city I've had the privilege of visiting. So thank you for being with me. I'm going to try and do three things today. The first is I'll tell you why I wrote this book. I'll tell you what's in the book, and I'll finish with some reflections on the Australianness of this book. And that's new material, which is a risky endeavor, so I ask for your patience with that. I moved to this country when I was 8 from South Korea, and I didn't speak English at the time. And I learned that the hardest part of crossing language lines is adjusting to real-life conversation. And that the hardest conversations to adjust to were disagreements. Because that was when passions tend to run, the rhythms of speech start to break down, and people start to interrupt. And I wouldn't have had the vocabulary for this at the time, but I also sensed what a lot of newcomers do, which is that their welcomeness to a place can feel conditional. That it's only to a certain extent. As long as you don't shake the boat too much or object to the way things are. And I experienced that as a newcomer to a country, but I've since recognized it as a part of our experience whenever we go to a new workplace or a city or even a party. The combination of those things made me resolve at that young age to be very agreeable, to smile, to nod along, and keep most of my thoughts to myself. And the thing that broke me out of this posture of conflict aversion was a promise that my Year 5 teacher made me, which was that in debating, when one person speaks, no one else does. And to someone who was used to being spoken over and interrupted and spun out of conversation, that sounded like a kind of salvation. And when I stood up in Year 5 for our first debate at the Wahroonga Public School to the north of Sydney, the Bush School, and the topic was that we should ban all zoos, and we were on the affirmative side. And I stood in the school auditorium, the rain falling down on the corrugated iron roof. And when I stood on stage and I began to speak, I started to see lots of movements, small movements in the audience, kind of like what I'm seeing now. And those small movements are just a kind of wince of recognition at the corner of people's eye, or the way in which people unfold their arms or turn to the person next to them and say, "Are you hearing this?" And I started to think that a world that had seemed to me quite fixed, frozen in place, hard surfaces that I would have to adjust to and assimilate to, I started to think that maybe through language and speech, you could start to change the world in subtle ways too. All of that for an 8-year-old, 10-year-old, was a lot. And in short, I was hooked. And as I began to devote more and more of my middle and high school years in Sydney, and my high school debate teammate Max and Kate are here. And as I carried that over into the US, where I studied for university, I learned that what I had considered a kind of a handicap or a disadvantage, which was my coming from a marginal place, was in fact a gift. That the best debaters tended to be slightly peripheral figures because they knew to listen before they spoke, to read a room, to figure out where the conversation was before you raised your own perspective. I also learned that the life of a debater has extraordinary highs and many more lows. The World Universities Debating Championship, for example, has 500 teams who compete, and there's only one winner. So almost all the time, you're going to be in the 499. And I've been saying on tour that experience teaches you a certain humility, that you can be persuasive and that you can be correct, that you can be fully persuaded of your position and still be the less convincing side on the day. I've been saying that when you get used to taking the wins as well as the losses, your attention shifts to, well, if I know I'm going to win sometimes, if I'm going to lose sometimes, are we playing the game by a set of rules we can be comfortable with? That's a kind of sportsmanship of disagreeing well. That we're not going to win every argument or lose every argument, but that it's in all of our interests to be able to disagree well, to practice disagreement by a set of norms we can endorse. I've said all that and I believe it, but the one time I won also felt really good. And that was in January 2016 in Thessaloniki, Greece, where my university debate partner from Swaziland, who had once been an opponent of mine in high school debate and become my university debate partner, won the world championship in that country. If I wrote the book then, and I was approached to write the book for the first time then, the story would have read like a sports memoir, a very sedentary version of a sports memoir, of a person learning a new craft and through a series of contests rising to the top of a sport. But what happened several months after that great victory, at least in my life, was the presidential election cycle between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, where the debates were hijacked before everybody's eyes and used as a tool for a brand of politics that was divisive and toxic for that country where I had been studying. The year after I graduated from University in America, I moved to China and did a master's degree at the height of optimism about the possibility of exchange between West and East. And months after I made that move, the trade war between the US and China set in, and the freeze that we're still living through began. The year after that, I moved back home, started working at the Australian Financial Review, and I covered in 2019 a federal election where by some measures, the level of polarization we had seen, the amount of distaste between political opponents was at a historical high. At that time, it became very difficult to see disagreement as anything other than a source of pain and division. And you saw bookshelves and libraries fill with studies of the roots of our polarization and reminders that democracy is a very fragile thing. But in those books and in the important prescriptions for how we get out of this messy political moment, I saw very little that individual people could do. And what they could do to address the ways in which division and polarization are made to feel real in our day-to-day lives, which is disagreements that we have with others. And in that moment where the world, I think, was losing hope in what disagreement could do, I began to think back to my childhood and what it was that had changed my view of what disagreements could be, and that was in debating. And it was in that search for some positive contribution, some tradition that could be reclaimed, some set of skills that we could learn, that brought me to write this book. So the book is in two parts. The first part presents the elements of debating. It starts with setting the topic. It walks people through the details of how you make an argument and how you respond to it, how you marshal language and speech and gesture to be maximally persuasive in the way in which you communicate those ideas. And I talk about the importance of silence, of choosing your battles in debating too. And once I've walked people through that basic toolkit, in the second half of the book, I apply it to different arenas of life where I think disagreement plays a very important role. Those are disagreements with bullies, actually people who argue in bad faith. Then I look at disagreements in our personal lives with loved ones, disagreements in education, and in the final chapter on technology. It reads as a mix of memoir and some instruction, and there are stories from history where the progression of change over time comes to a head in these clashes between two people and in the conversations it gives rise to. I think it is a kind of a countercultural argument at a time when so much of the ethic is about finding our own people. We say that in our dating lives. We say that in our search to find friends. But in our politics, we talk about turning out the base, right? And trying to marshal all the resources that we can. The driving thesis of this book is that the opposite of bad disagreement, which is the problem that we're facing, is not agreement, but it's good disagreement. And though it is countercultural, I don't think it is. I don't want it to unduly romanticize the past. Because I think what we're trying to do at this moment, where we've given a greater number of people the ability to speak, where we're trying to manage a greater level of diversity in our communities than we ever have before, and still disagree well, feels to me quite unprecedented. And so it is not a traditional book in the sense of hearkening back to some romanticized past that I'm not sure ever existed, but is writing towards a kind of a future, the shape of which is not completely within view. Before I get into the conversation part of the evening, and I'll stay tonight as long as you have questions afterwards, I'll conclude with some reflections on what I believe is the Australianness of this book. It is a verifiable fact that Australians are very good at competitive debate. So the World Schools, High Schools Debate Championships was started by an Australian, and it has been won by Australia more so than any other country. At the World Universities level, local universities regularly outpace the Ivy League, the Oxbridge universities, and other often much better resourced colleges and universities around the world. Part of that surely owes to the strength of our education system and the economic prosperity and political stability that undergirds it. But I think it also owes something to our location at the periphery of the world. That location gives us a certain critical distance that the largest metropolises and superpowers of the world lack. That the awareness that things are not always within our control gives us a sense of humor, of irony, of a skepticism towards conceit. And living as I do now, where back in the US people drink at bars, I'm often nostalgic for a country where the pub test is an important measure of political success. And so this book is in some ways my answer to the question, what did it mean for me to grow up here and not somewhere else? And one part of that is that I learned to be a debater in a country of arguers. But I want to conclude with two challenges that I see for this country and its culture of argument. The first is that we are not immune from the tendency that we see around the world to lose the skill of disagreeing. And that's what it is. Disagreeing is work, it's craft, it's effort. It's not something that we just engage in. And especially of importance to this country is sometimes a tendency to import in the paranoid style of American politics, for example, a certain gracelessness about our public disagreements that is unforgiving towards the mistakes people make when they engage in conversation. And on the other side, a language of entitlement that speaks to the right to speak, but never of the responsibility to do it well. I think those things are often quite foreign to an underlying strength that I see in a country that is so well educated, that prizes disagreement, that has that sense of irony and humor that I praised earlier. And I hope it's a part of our culture that we retain, take pride in, and strengthen. The second challenge that I see, and this is really a limitation of debate, is we can sink too far into the critic's repose. That a population so skilled in argument and poking holes can sometimes content itself with that being the only thing we do, right? And in debating, one of the things you learn is when you're against an opponent who says no to everything, you say, well, what's your solution for that? And so knowing the limits of what argument can and can't do for us, knowing when it's time to stop talking about the thing and actually doing it, I think is another piece of the puzzle I'd like to leave with you. In the end, this is a book about debating, and debating is one answer to the question, how do we disagree well? It's not the only answer to the question. And disagreeing well is only one answer to the question, what do we do about the fact that we are all different, but that we must find a way to live together? And I hope this is one contribution to answering that question, but the only way in which we make progress on that, I think, is by piecing together an answer together and living it out. So as you would in debating, once you've stopped speaking, you hand the microphone over to the other side. And it's in that spirit I offer the book to you. And I hope tonight's conversation can be the start of many more conversations on this subject. So thank you very much for being here.
Well, what a wonderful speech. And I'm just grateful that I'm asking the questions tonight and I'm not the first speaker negative. I'm going to take you both straight to your arrival at Harvard. You're now in your early 20s and you're going to start a degree there. You join in with their debating team. This is a Harvard debating tradition that's gone back centuries. And I love this quote from your book when you talked about the debating people you met at Harvard. They are like cooked sugar left at the bottom of the pan. They tend to be intense, stuck on, and prone to bitterness. But as an Australian, you won them over and thrived. Tell us about that.
I say some nice things in the book as well. This comes halfway through the book where I've learned the skills of disagreeing well, I think, and of debating well. And I get to university, and by this time, everybody has learned how to do the basic exercise of debating. And we've gotten it as sharp as we could. And this was a moment both in the book and in my own life where I saw the limits of what just being good at debating can do, right? Of putting together arguments and explaining how certain you are about them. And one of the things that I had to learn to do is to choose my battles in disagreement, to make concessions, to sometimes acknowledge where it is that I was coming from in a debate, right? And that can be a scary thing even in writing this book, showing where the idea comes from rather than speaking from this voice of God perspective makes you more vulnerable, right? And so I think I learned from MasterChef the only way to fix burnt caramel is to add other ingredients. And I had to do that.
Let me take you to another quotation which I loved from the book as well, about the middle as well. You're talking about your father. And he said, a good argument is one where those who are arguing walk away with an understanding of its terrain. And those of you who heard Bo on Weekend Extra, or Saturday Extra last weekend, Catherine Robinson asked the same sort of question. And you said, a good argument is when both people walk away and say that it's been worthwhile. Do you want to expand on that?
There are attempts to answer the question, which is, what do we want our disagreements to do for us? And for me, the fact that there are many answers to that question, sometimes we want our disagreements to expose us to a new perspective, right? Sometimes we need to actually persuade the other side to win them over. Sometimes it's, we just have a piece that we need to get out there and have someone listen to it, right? The fact that there is that variety, I think, is important because when we think the only way in which we succeed in a disagreement is by winning over the other side or by showing that we were the more dominant side, it narrows the possibility for what disagreements can do for us. And Dad would have said, at the end of this disagreement, neither of us have moved in our position very much, but we know what we're arguing about now. And in the next conversation, we might be able to shift a little bit. So for me, it's the second thing that you said, that at a minimum, a good argument is one in which both sides go away from the exchange saying, I would do that again. It doesn't have to be life-changing, it doesn't have to have made all your dreams come true, but I would do that again is enough to keep the conversation going. And I think maybe increasing or broadening our view of the things we can get out of disagreements and about the different things we can get out of disagreements when we have them one conversation at a time, can put us on the right track towards disagreeing better with one another.
Let me put the contrary view. Now we're comparing fathers. My late dad did not like to disagree with anyone, and if a disagreement was coming along, he would walk away from it, figuring that was the best way to approach that. And indeed, those of us who were schooled on Dale Carnegie's The Art of winning friends and influencing people, would say that in fact the best thing to do is to avoid arguments. What do you say to that?
My book won't sell as much.
I was going to say, that's not the theme of the book, I can assure you.
Maybe I picked the wrong side of the topic on this. I'd say I tried that. I tried the Carnegie approach, which is to avoid disagreeing. Yeah. And I found that it narrowed the connection you can make with another person when you're just clinging on to the narrow sliver of agreement that stands between you, and you don't get to engage with the fullness of the other side. But you also don't get to meet the version of you that comes out through conversation with others. And that's not just the version of me that came through involvement in debating, but the part of you that comes out in every real moment of connection between two people. So I'd say I tried it. And then maybe the other thing I would say is, I'm not sure the luxury of walking away from the disagreements that might arise is a luxury we can often afford in a country that's as diverse as this one.
Which takes me beautifully to my next question about cultural differences. There's another view in me that says so many of our disagreements are cultural,
yes,
maybe language, maybe interpretations, maybe translations. There was an idea 100 years ago that if we all had one common language, Esperanto at the time, that we would have fewer disagreements. Would we, or would you think that somehow or other, if we all became the same culture and language, we'd have fewer disagreements?
We might, but it would come at an enormous cost. I do think there is a need to find some common language of disagreement so that we're able to talk across cultures. But even the different ways in which nations and cultural groups disagree and how those clash with one another, I think can be creative and generative. One of the stories that I tell in the book that starts the book is the story of the Tower of Babel, right? And the idea was the source of our present ills is that as punishment for our hubris, we were burdened with many languages. But as you actually get at in the question to that, the destruction of the tower was also the beginning of travel. It's how we were dispersed around the world. It was the beginning of translation, right? It was the beginning of a kind of an exchange. And so it's burden and it's work, but it's also opportunity that gives our lives a richness that I think belonging to one culture would lack.
Let me toss out another contradiction or potential contradiction as well, and that's going back.
You are debating, Rick.
I am. Where? First speaker negative. There might be some lawyers or law students in the audience tonight. As you would probably appreciate, lawyers love to be litigious. Lawyers love to take a particular side. Lawyers love a debate, sometimes a bitter debate in courtrooms.
Yep.
The bottom line is that although we don't teach it anymore, it happens. Why do lawyers persist with the idea of not trying to reach some sort of agreement, but having their day in court and winning, taking all? How's that survived, if you're right? Now, I'm a debater.
And a lawyer too. It survived because we have a theory that an adversarial system, for all of its flaws, is a powerful engine for unearthing truth when it's contested, of forcing both sides to be the best they can be in some ways, to put the case as strongly as they can, and that through the process of conflict, something positive will come out. One of the things that I said just at the end of my remarks is disagreement is one answer to the question of how we coexist when we're different. And in that way, I think litigation and the process of adjudicating legal disputes is one answer to the question, what happens when we disagree, right? And one of the things that I wrestle with, and I should really defer to you on this question, but one thing I wrestle with now as a law student is there is certainly a role for that adversarial ethic and that system, but how big a slice of the pie should it be, right? Because next to litigation is mediating our differences, forgiving people who break the law, grace, mercy, right? These are a different constellation of values that don't often find a home in the legal system. So I am quite committed to the idea that good argument and people presenting the best case and arguing about them, that there are a lot of positives to that. But I think that argument becomes weaker when it doesn't account for the other ways in which we should sort out our disputes and deal with our differences.
And let me assure you, as you would know, and the audience as well, that we also teach dispute resolution. Right. In fact, it used to be called alternative dispute resolution, so someone pointed out that was actually 99% of the way in which legal matters were resolved.
It's probably good that class ends at some point and people just go out to dinner and they learn a different way.
But speaking of bellicose approaches, let's quickly go to parliaments and politicians. And I loved this particular quote when you were talking about the 2016 Trump versus Hillary Clinton debate, where Trump said this about Mexicans. And this is a quotation. I'm not making this up. Quote, "They're bringing in crime. They're bringing in drugs. They are rapists. But some, I presume, are good people." Where do you go with that? Perhaps I'll let you to think about that, because speaking of Trump...
I appreciate the grace.
Speaking of Trump, he popularised alternative facts. He now got this phrase, fake news. But how does a listener, faced with an idiot who says that Trump actually won a rigged election or the moon landing was staged, how does a listener tackle that, or doesn't he or she bother?
These are some of the most difficult questions that I try to wrestle with in the book, but where the answer is incomplete. But where I would start is there is enormous power in being able to name what a bad faith arguer is doing. So for me, the term dog whistle, which is what that quotation is an empowering term to know, because you can say that is what's unfolding in front of you. And there are strategies in debating, because debating like any community has bad faith arguers, of how we respond to that. So with something like that where he's being slippery about the claims, right, of having it this way and having it that way, one of the things a debater might do is say, well, what is your actual position? Right? What is the claim that you're making before getting stuck into it? Right? And finally, with bad faith actors, it can often be useful to pause and say, is it a debate that we're trying to have, or is it just a brawl? Right? And returning to some agreement about the kind of conversation that we want to have. And you may have to defer the conversation. Right? And we say, I'm not interested in just calling each other names. Right? I don't want to engage in that kind of disagreement. And so being able to name what is happening, to try and counteract it, but also to insist on the kind of conversation we want to have, I think, can be a start. The question about misinformation and disinformation is another difficult one. I'm quite convinced that misinformation thrives in communities where all you have are like-minded folks egging each other on. These are echo chambers, right? And so there is a need to challenge, right? And to have a public square where people aren't congregated in these tribes that already agree with one another and where you don't hear an alternative view. I also believe debating is a powerful engine for sorting truth for lies, because the advantage that truth has over a lie is that things add up, right? And you can point out the inconsistencies. But it's quite true that we're living at a very dangerous time where it's not one bit of misinformation, but the misinformation becomes the basis of an entire worldview. And in that world, that sorting mechanism of debate, the way through challenge you're able to privilege truth over lie, that becomes a lot less effective. And I think probably debate has a role to play in breaking down echo chambers and all of those things, and I believe that. But it's probably one part of a broader education that we need. And it's probably one that has to start at a young enough age where we're training people to discern good arguments from bad, to insist on evidence, right? And to have the skills to be able to judge whether it supports the claims that are being made. So I think debate is one part of the education, but only one part.
Which is a nice little segue to this next question, which is one of the write-in questions. We're not taking questions from the audience tonight, but a number of questions that I'm including tonight are ones that people had pre-submitted. And this one is on a similar vein, adding another variable. How does one have a reasonable debate with a loved one who's a conspiracy theorist?
Yeah. I'm not sure that's what makes them lovable.
And you'd remind them of that.
And by the way, so we won't take questions in the event, but I'll stay around and take questions if people have them. I'll start at a more general level, which is why our disagreements with loved ones tend to go badly. And I think it's often because they become all-consuming, right? We do something quite wonderful with our loved ones, which is we decide to share our lives together. But that amount of overlap means there's a lot of things you could disagree about. So a disagreement about the dirty dishes becomes also about what you did last month or what the mother-in-law or the father-in-law did, so on and so on, until it becomes unmanageable. And in the same way, I think even with someone who has political views that you have distaste for or subscribe to conspiracy theories, I think one starting place for me would be to say, to come to some agreement about what's on the tables in this dispute. So what's at stake in this dispute is not whether I love you or not. I do. It's not even whether we're going to continue living together or not. In most instances, we will. We're just talking about this issue. We're also not talking about whether this issue is typical of character flaws you might have. We're really just talking about the moon landing or whatever the issue might be. And I can sort of understand the impulse to bring a lot of different subjects in because there's a lot at stake when it's a loved one. They're all within reach, but being more content with tackling things one conversation at a time and doing it step by step, of putting constraints on what's on the table for this hour and what's off it. That's where I'd start.
On the subject of love, it occurs to me that if there's someone whom you love spouting an argument, you're far more likely to accept it than someone you don't like. I'm thinking of politicians like the great Bob Hawke, who was very loved, who probably could say a lot more about winning us over than someone who's not.
Oh.
So we've talked about the quality of the debate, we've talked about the quality of the arguments. What about the quality of the personality?
I love that question.
I love you as well.
I appreciate it. Things have...
There's a mutual admiration society going on up
That's
here.
true.
It's got a membership of 2.
Things have and are escalating very quickly. Can't believe I'm saying this sentence, but I guess it's a question of what love is. And one important part of love for me, how I understand it, is attention. And when it comes to thinking about political leaders who can move us, can stir something in us, I think it's often a mistake to think about, are they using some literary techniques? You've seen that, and people say, he's using some Latin, like kind of a spell. And I don't really believe that. I think it's often they have a pulse on where the listener is, and that comes from listening, right? It comes from taking them where they are. And I think that's a kind of an attention that tends towards love. And as is appropriate for love, we know it when we see it.
You've been an observer of Australian politics for a good 20 years. Here's a question that was one of the write-in questions as well. Do you think there's a maturing of our political debate along this kind of strongly refined debating points, or are we still sticking with the bellicosity? And if so, why are we not maturing?
There are some signs of hope.
I like to finish on a note of hope.
Some. So, for example, I thought the rise of independents, for example, who aren't sticking by a script in quite the same way in which we've heard. The sound of... And how does that sound? It sounds kind of clashing sometimes. It clashes against our expectations. It's less polished, less same than the kind of politics that we've seen with the two-party system sometimes. So maybe that's the most recent change or development that my mind goes to. But as I say, where I locate the hope is in how we disagree day to day in this country. And so the format of debate I did was called the Parliamentary format of debate. And you might think that comes out of the House of Commons in the UK. But in fact, where competitive debate comes from is next to the House of Commons, there were pubs and coffee houses where people emulated the structure of parliamentary debate or took its agenda and they practiced it there. So that's where it comes from. And so what hope I see, I would locate there. In pubs and coffee houses, their equivalents, which is how ordinary people talk to one another, that for all its flaws, I think outpaces the work of our politicians.
And of course, the famous pub test draws from that as well. We're heading far too rapidly towards the 7 o'clock deadline, but there are two more questions that people had in their writing. I want to put them to you. One is again about the future and about hope. How best can we inspire the next generations to be more interested in quality debating and indeed in good online debating etiquette?
Well, I'll try and address them separately. Just on the question of the next generation, I think the impulse to argue is actually quite a natural impulse among children. And to quarrel and to put forward a strong view, just to poke the other side and see how you're going to be received. And there's a lot that beats that out of you. And that could be schoolyard bullies. It could be the sense that I think a lot of children have, which is that they're not being taken seriously. So I would think of it less as instilling an impulse to argue than not rewarding, but giving it space to develop. In terms of online disagreements, I do think the skills of disagreeing well and being alive to what disagreements can and shouldn't be can make us more demanding in what we demand of the channels where we communicate, right? So we might think a channel where a not insignificant number of participants are robots or where the algorithms privilege the most inflammatory material as a way to drive engagement, that a population more attuned to what disagreement should be can vote with our feet, can be more demanding on what we ask of it. There are some strategies for disagreeing well online, and I report them in the book, and I try and be faithful to them. But for me, I take the argument of, at least my book, as saying, we need to return to face-to-face conversation. And the particular encounter that face-to-face conversations can give rise to in a way that I think is at quite at odds in a time of reproduction and memification and so some of the message of this book is step away from the screen.
Bo, the question that has come in again that I was looking at, and it's the last question for the night, it's not addressed in the book. Have you ever debated the existence of God, and if so, how did you go?
I have never gotten this question, maybe unsurprisingly. I actually have, and I grew up in the Christian church, and I remember one of my close friends in high school telling me he didn't believe in God, and I remember in that moment, I saw him so clearly, more fully than I think I had seen him before. Because he was someone who was different than me, at least on this belief. And I had to address that. And so I think I've had versions of this conversation that have gone better or worse, but that starting place of disagreement as a way of seeing the other person fully, I had that experience in an important way on a conversation on this very subject.
Let me bring this to an end and a summary by saying this is a terrific read. I enjoyed every word of it. Not only does it teach the reader debating skills, it explores the art of dissecting syllogisms, it takes you through the history of Greek philosophy, evolutionary psychology. It recites some of the great debates, such as those between de Klerk and Mandela, Nixon and Khrushchev, Malcolm X and his detractors, and brings the reader along the ride of Bo's own national and international debating victories, I should say with incredible recall about what was said, who debated what, including telling us that his love life suffered when a potential date disappeared from his room the moment a pile of Economist magazines were brought to him. I'm waiting for the movie of this book. If they can make chess sexy with the Queen's Gambit, they can do something with this particular book. I even have a title, Withering Slates, or Gone with the Third Speaker Affirmative. You'll play yourself, I'll play Socrates. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, it's a bloody good read. Please thank Bo Seo. That was terrific.